This victory is for Indigenous women, for Native women, for Black women, for our LGBTQ plus neighbors and relatives, for low-income folks, for people who live in rural communities, and for everyone who has fought for sovereignty of their own bodies. I am so grateful that we have leaders in our Minnesota House and Senate who made sure that this was one of the first bills to pass in 2023. And I want to recognize, along with the governor, that it was women who got this done. So thank you to my mom and to all of the mothers and grandmothers and aunties and advocates who prepared us for this fight, this victory. Today, it is for you.
Hi, I'm Ana Marie Cox. This is 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. We've been counting down the election since 87 days ago, which means there are 3 days left until the election. Vote if you haven't voted. Ask your friends if they have a plan to vote. Maybe look into ballot curing or phone banking. This is the most important election of our lifetimes, and you want to do all you can. This is a show where we talk to smart people about what they think and feel about this historic, unprecedented, crazy-making, brain-melting election. And then my smart person today is Peggy Flanagan. She is the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota. Hi, Peggy.
Hi. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, good. I don't need to tell you why I think you're important to talk to. You're very smart. You are the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota. And I have been dying to know what you are thinking, feeling, experiencing right now.
Sure. Well, I think I am thinking and feeling much of what Americans are thinking and feeling. I think I'm hopeful about our future because I have watched folks, be activated and mobilized and willing to fight for something. And I'm also a little nervous and scared for our future if things don't turn out the way that I would like them to turn out, which is with the election of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. But I also have to say, as a Native American woman, we have been through difficult things before and are resilient and will come out on the other side, no matter what happens.
I think that might be the most important thing that this audience could hear you say, because the history of the United States has not been a one of upward and onward all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it has not been one where everything's been kind of fine and then bad things happen.
Mm-hmm.
We're a country founded on genocide. And we're a country, founded on chattel slavery. And there are people in this country who've experienced intense oppression that have survived and thrived and been the people who are on the front lines of expanding those rights, expanding like what we need to do. Do you want to talk a little more about like the resilience piece, like where that comes from for you? Maybe just personally. I mean, you could expand it if you want, but like, what is the practice of resilience?
So I'm not always good at it. I just want to be really candid. But I do think, in those, just really in those moments when things get hard or unclear, it is absolutely just to remember that despite everything, that we are still here. And I find great comfort in the fact that we have always been here. We are still here, and Indigenous people will be here into the future. And I think, that I watch, I have a 11-year-old daughter, and I watch her, be really thoughtful about how she treats other people and how she shows up and how she um, just has a big heart and cares a lot. She's also very funny and weird. And I think for me, that is one of the things that is resilience, right? It is that we have been loved into existence by the people who came before us. And I think a lot about my mom and what she went through, as a non Native woman, but as a single mom who just worked so hard and tried to make it work and fought for me and made sure I knew how important voting was and standing up for yourself and others. And now I am trying to model that right with my child, and she will then do that right with the young people around her. And so it's that it is that we continue, we have to fight every generation for the kind of life that we want to have. And I also see us in a moment where people are returning to right our culture and our language, and that we are in a moment where he are really visible in a way that we just haven't been before, right? In electoral politics, in philanthropy, certainly in the media, and are able to tell our own stories and speak for ourselves. That is, I think, in many ways, resiliency. And so, um, it is it's difficult, right? And it's difficult. I think sometimes to encourage, Native folks to get involved with a system that was not created by us or for us, but in many ways was created to eliminate us. And so I think, even just the act of voting and participating and running for office is a way that we work to change these systems from the inside out, so that these systems themselves, uh, I think become better, right, when we are a part of them. And that is also part of our resiliency and survival, is working within these systems to ensure that they're serving more people, um, than the folks that they were built for way back
Yeah.
in the day.
And I find a lot of hope in the administration that you shared with Tim Walz,
Mhm.
right? And something I think that is probably pretty vital to talk about, again, no matter what happens on Tuesday, is the ability to move people who grew up in the system, white people, white men, white cis heterosexual men, to move them from being well meaning and great and progressive to Tim Wall said something that I find like I'm going to get teary about. He said a couple things. One is housing is a human right, which I've never heard someone say from a stage at that level, a Democrat say from a stage at that level. And I don't know what's going to happen with that. But just to hear it was amazing, right? But the other thing is even more important, which is the purpose of political capital is to spend it. And he did that. And I just haven't seen a lot of that from Democrats. And I know you're a part of that change. So what happened there? Like
um,
what? Like what? Like he was a moderate Democrat, right? Like, am I misremembering history?
I think um, I think he cares a lot, and I think
Yeah.
that's what you saw, right? I think, but here's what I know about that moment. I think the easy way to explain that, what happened when we had, this trifecta and passed all this good policies, like, oh, we won in 2022 and we had a House majority and we had a Senate majority in Minnesota and the governor's office. And so we just voted for things and we passed them. Like
Right.
that would be the easy story. Um, the real story is that like we've been organizing towards these wins for the last 2 decades. And then once the conditions were right, we ran as hard and as fast as we could to deliver on the promises that we made to folks across the state. And I think a decade ago we had a trifecta, right? We had DFLers in control of the House and Senate and did some good things like passed all day kindergarten, protected marriage equality, and signed an increase into the minimum wage index to inflation. And I was a co-chair of that campaign, and it was a really big deal. But so many of us who are advocates in that moment or organizers were like, hey, we can do more. And I think that at the time it was like, oh gosh, I don't know, right? They were playing not to lose instead of playing to win. And I think that is the difference. A decade later, many of us who were advocates at that time were then in elected office or were leading organizations to have a really strong inside outside game at the Capitol. So once we had that trifecta, we had our plan. We knew
Yeah.
what we wanted to do, right? When Siobhan was a baby, when my daughter was a baby, I was one of the co-founders of Minnesotans for Paid Family and Medical Leave. We didn't sign that into law, right, until she was 10 years old. So I think there's also just this story of like, keep organizing, keep doing the work, like perfecting and refining these policies to get them to a point where, like, I am confident we will have one of the best paid family and medical leave programs in the country because we worked on it and we refined it and we made it better. And then that is the version that we passed.
Yeah.
And so, Tim Walz was a part of, that work and that organizing. And I think also, like, we didn't do anything, and folks are like, oh, you did so much. It's like, we just did the things that we told people we were
Yeah.
going to do. And then they voted for us to do those things.
I want to just put a real big sign on this is not the Tim Walz story. Love him. He's great. You went for him as Halloween. A bunch of Democratic governors did, which let's hope they do the policies as well as like cosplaying as Tim Walz, right? Like,
I mean, I think I had the best costume. Let's be honest.
Right.
Like,
it's a great costume. He's great. Look, posit that he's great. Right. But the Minnesota story is not the Tim Walz story. The Minnesota story is the 2 decades of organizing. And if I may be so bold, it's the progressive version, the radical progressive version of Project 2025. It is making it possible, giving the playbook. It is having all that stuff ready to go and having pushed and pushed and pushed so that when you get the trifecta, when you get that power, the guy at the top doesn't have to be super progressive, right? That's what I hear you saying.
Well, I would argue that I don't actually think anything that we did is radical.
No,
yeah, but I think like that's like, and that's how we like should be talking about these things. Like, feeding kids breakfast and lunch is not like, that's like, we're just feeding kids because it's the right thing to do. And like a year later, we've served kids 150 million meals. Attendance is up, illness is down, test scores are up, kids are doing great. Like, that's like, in my opinion, pragmatic, right? And things that you should be doing because it's like good for people and good for the entire state. And so I think that is who Tim Walz is, right? Like, he's like a kid, and like, kid can't do well in their geography test, right? If they, have an empty belly, like, because he's a teacher and is like, this is what I've seen in my classroom. So I think so many of the things that we did are just like, this is good for people. So we're going to do those things.
All right. I'm going to reframe. Radical only in the context of where America is right now. In the context of world politics, of countries like ours, the kinds of things that y'all did in Minnesota are not radical or controversial at all.
Totally. But they are now in the context of,
So when I say like progressive 2025, what I kind of mean more is not the radical what they want to do, which is weird and crazy and
terrifying.
Terrifying. But more like to have that constant building of coalitions and feeding people into the system, right? Get starting at the ground level with organizing in your neighborhood, in your community, working up the ladder and having all of that ready to go when you get the trifecta.
For sure.
Like, and just having it be already having made the arguments, maybe that's a part of it too.
I think that's part of it. And I think
made those arguments at the ground level
Mhm.
so that when you get to later, people are like, "Oh yeah, feeding kids."
We should do that. Mhm.
Yeah, I don't have to make that argument at the top because it's
For
already been
sure.
made
Yeah, and I
1,000
think,
times.
for the last 6 years of our administration and, when we were running, like, our whole goal was to, for Tim Walz and Peggy Flanagan, was to make Minnesota the best place in the country to raise a child. And so everything that we, have done, I think has really been through that lens. And so it is, 20 years of organizing that I would argue many of those roots started in the Wellstone for Senate campaign in 2002. Um, and then was, our election in 2018 also just being very clear that we're going to do stuff for kids and we're going to center children and families within government, which I think a lot of people talk about, like we care about children, right? But I think that we have been super intentional in building out a policy platform, right, that does that, combined with these 20 years of organizing. And that's where we are, and an island of decency in the upper Midwest.
And I'm considering moving back.
You should come
Like
home.
we we'll talk about it offline. Like, you know,
But I appreciate your vote in Texas. Thank you for
yeah.
voting there.
But
That matters.
see my license plate.
I do, absolutely. Yes.
I consider it my adopted home state for sure. Um, uh, I think again, this conversation is really important because it's a no matter who wins conversation. It's you can't take a breath, right? Or we can take a breath. Yes, sure. Everyone breathe. Everyone. But my hope would be to take this idea national, no matter what the context, to take it to the ground level and build these coalitions and have these discussions, right? So it just seems obvious later. It doesn't like you're not making the argument all of a sudden we need to give kids. I'm just using free lunch, free breakfast kind of as an example of a suite of policies, right? Including being safe havens for trans kids. Like Minnesota is a safe haven for trans kids and a safe haven for abortion seekers, right?
That's right.
Which I all about raising safe and healthy kids to me,
Totally.
right?
Exactly. That is also grounded, right, in that vision of the best place for children.
Right.
Yeah,
And I also think so having those conversations at the ground level and so that they don't have to make them they're just obvious by the time you get to governor, by the time you get to president. It's like, well, of course we're going to do this. We've been talking about it for a while and everyone agrees. But I want to ask I love the idea of an organizing vision, being safe place for kids, wonderful place to raise a family. And I wonder if that actually is a framework through which to see almost every kind of good social safety net and not I won't use the word radical, sorry, but anti-racist, anti-patriarchy, like you can say almost any of the things that we want to work for justice are part of raising kids and like part of making the world a safer, better place to raise a family.
for sure. I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot is that children don't come in pieces. And we can't have a policy approach, right? That is like do one thing here and then one thing over here. Like we really have to be clear about what it is that we're building out, right? So um, it is that whole approach, right, of making sure that kids are fed, right, at school, but also in the summer. We are the first state in the country to sign up for summer EBT for families, and I think that matters. Making sure that folks have access, right, to healthcare. We had one of the most significant investment we've ever made in housing was in this last biennium, and it was a full spectrum, right? So it was like from our relatives who are experiencing homelessness to emergency shelter to transitional housing to uh, you know housing vouchers to making sure that, people could buy their first home. And, having a safe place to live, a place for kiddos to sleep at night, to do their homework, right? At the kitchen table. And, all of those pieces, uh, the child tax credits, right, that will lower child poverty by a third in our state, investments in transportation, like all of these things. It's been so important, to really look at, like, kind of go to the balcony and look at the big picture of all the things that we're trying to do together. Access to reproductive health care is also part of that. Banning conversion therapy, also part of that, right? Like, so um, when you think about, and also, like, I think so much of what, Tim Wall says, and it's a catchphrase, but I think it's also just like really true, is, the like, we just want people to mind their own damn business. That is also, I think, what justice looks like, right? Like, people just being able to, like, be themselves and not be afraid of any harm that will come to them. And just being able to live, right? Like, I think that's really what we're going for here. And, Minnesotans, were humble people, so we're not going to puff up a lot about the work that we did here. But, like, in this moment, I think it's important to just say, like, there's another way to do this, where we don't have to demonize each other, where you don't have to be told you have to hate your neighbors. We can just make sure that, like, everybody's doing okay. Like, that feels all right.
I remember the marriage equality um, campaign, or
Right. Yes.
the anti-defining marriage as a man and a woman campaign in 2012,
It
right?
was, yes, it was 2012. And the reason I remember it was 2012, I worked on that campaign and was very pregnant with my daughter as I was working on that campaign. So it felt extra pressure to win and get it right.
That was the first year I lived in Minnesota. And if people don't know, it was the first time a state rejected that kind of amendment. They'd been like that had been a safe play for Republicans across the country, right? To like get people out to vote for marriage inequality. And so Minnesota was the first state to defeat that. And it was done on a mind your own damn business message.
Hmm. Yeah.
There was two messages that I remember. It was so smart. So wow, you did a great job. There was the mind your own damn business, which appealed to Minnesotans. And then there were all those ads about, like, I'm going to get into this, I get emotional, especially like right now, like how things are happening. There are those commercials that had like a couple had been married for 30 years saying like, what's this going to do to us?
Right.
You know, I don't know. Like it feels like, again, like all of the kinds of things that are happening to Minnesota, and that I would hope that we can bring nationwide. And Minnesota's not the only state that's done some of this, right? Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not as familiar. But I know about, I mean, I was there for a lot of this,
Yeah.
I was very proud to tell people I got to vote for Tim Walz and Peggy Flanagan.
Thank you.
Um, uh, is just the kind of common sense stuff. And like, this is just makes the world a better place. This just makes it safer. And this also takes, it takes pressure off of existing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's right. And I think the campaign was so powerful because we also talked, like, so often when you do, calls on a campaign, it's to, um, like, ID someone, and, like, we want to make sure that, like, we're very clear, like, where they stand on an issue, and, don't want to be rude, but we don't want to spend a whole lot of time there. And this campaign was, we want you to call people and we want you to talk about love, right? And it was like, and we had enough volunteers and people on the phones and on the doors who were really, like, encouraged, like, to just talk about love and your family, and, why you're married and why you think that, that shouldn't be denied to somebody else. I mean, it really was this beautiful campaign that was so grounded in relational organizing. Um, And, and really, I think targeting, doing smart targeting work in communities of color and indigenous communities and in the faith community and in rural communities. And I think that is also part of this, 2-decade long story of getting right to this moment with this trifecta in Minnesota. Because we started to talk to each other a little bit differently. And now, listen, I'm not telling you that like the divisiveness and the fracturing in our politics is not happening in Minnesota. It absolutely is. But my hope is that we can still, like, as Minnesotans, come back to just like that core of like, hey, mind your business, right? Or like, it doesn't, it's not going to impact you. Or just like those values around family and love, no matter what that family looks like. And that people just want to be able to live good lives. Right now, it's silly season, right? And it's like everything feels like it is on fire, and there's folks who are in or out, and human beings or not. But I am, regardless, right, of what happens, like bound and determined for us to like remember who the heck we are here, right?
That's a Minnesotan state. Who the
Yeah,
heck we are?
that's right. Oh gosh, yeah.
And I'm really glad you brought up the silly season and also that sense of urgency and also like the talk of violence, that is mainly on the other side. I mean, I have my Protect Trans Kids shirt with a knife, but I'm going to choose to remind people that this is out of love too. Like that it can come down to that, right? But also in the wide view of history, like there will be times that hopefully the rhetoric is not on a face-to-face, person-to-person, neighbor-to-neighbor level. I mean, I don't know. Like, I do get scared. There is a worst case scenario where the knife in Protect Trans Kids starts to be, you don't have to say this, but I'm going to, like, starts to be like, is that what I have to do? But it's good to hear you talk about the relational piece and the part of it that I don't think is just true to Minnesota. I mean, I think Minnesotans, it is true, have an unusually high tolerance for passive aggression and emphasis
Uh-huh.
emphasis on the passive, which let's go ahead and embrace that because they're going to listen to you longer than other people would.
Yeah, that's true.
They're going to not make you leave the part. Like you're going to get to have like a long okay, you want to have a conversation with Minnesotan about like trans rights, say you're about to leave the party. Um
I mean, and there's a thing that we do, right, when things get uncomfortable and where it's like, oh, who wants pie? Right? Like I call those who wants pie moments, right? Where we
right.
like immediately like people are uncomfortable. So we're gonna like switch the, topic of conversation to food. Right. And
Which
that
is
feels
all
better
good.
for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, let people have that. So maybe in Minnesota it's a little easier, but I do fundamentally believe that on a community, neighbor to neighbor, person to person level, like it's going to be possible to have conversations about justice and families and love, no matter who wins, Although I also think, and we can get back to just like pure electoral politics here. I mean, one reason why I've been still having like doing just interpersonal outreach with my friends is yeah, we're Texas, we got to run up the national vote. Like, we got to remind people there's more of us than them. Like, no matter what happens, because I think there's a potential for being really dispirited if it goes that way, if the national vote goes one way and the electoral college goes the other way. But again, this is just worst case scenario. I think if the national vote is really lopsided, there is hope to be taken in that, right? Like there is like the ability to keep going based on that. There are more of us than them.
But like here's the deal. We don't have a choice.
Yeah,
We have
sure.
to keep going.
Sure.
Right. And so like I think that's sometimes I get asked that question, which is like, how do you do this? How do you keep going? And I'm like, what choice do we have? And like that may just be because I'm me, right? And like I'm always gonna, I don't know, that's part of my personality, I guess. But we don't have a choice. We have to keep doing this work, right? And so, um, and I think the popular vote, absolutely, I agree with you. Like running that up really matters. Um, and uh, I also think that we have to be willing to, just really talk about what it is that we're fighting for and what we believe. I think many of us have been horrified by the things that we have seen. Throughout, you know, Donald Trump being very much in the political, public eye, but in the last week alone. And we can't we can't not name it and call it out, because I think there's sort of this vibe like, oh, then we'll call attention to it. Or I saw, some politician talking about on, social media, say like, oh, this is just a distraction. It's not. It's not just a distraction. It is a rallying cry for Donald Trump and, his followers.
All
And I
right,
think
Peggy,
go ahead.
call it out right now. Can you?
Yeah.
Call it out.
Yeah.
What do you
Yes.
want to do? What do you want to call it? It's not it.
So, yeah.
What is Donald Trump doing right now that is needed to be called out?
The racism and misogyny and violent rhetoric is absolutely not okay. And as Americans, we should not fall for it. And we shouldn't be used as pawns in, his quest for power. And so I think, that was, and I think as a woman, as a Native woman, and I think people of color, uh, you know, LGBTQ plus two spirit folks, right? Like, don't hear it as a distraction, right? It's not just a distraction to try to get us away from like what Kamala Harris is going to do for this country. It is deeply, uh, it's completely unacceptable and abhorrent, and we need to name it that way. Also, it makes people afraid, and so we're going to say this is not okay. And I won't, like use the phrase like this isn't who we are, like because there are things that we've done to each other as human beings, right? That are deeply unacceptable, but they're also part of our history, right? This is not who we should aspire to be. And our dream for our country should be much more inclusive and hopeful. Um, and I think we can get there. And that is like the fuel for my fire, right, over the next handful of days as we're coming up to the election. But then afterwards, too, right? Like this just cannot stand.
Yeah. And again, it's a no matter who wins situation. It is. Like it is creating I don't know, as Coach Wall's, you know, like phrase here is creating the playbook and being able to hand it up,
Hmm.
right?
That's right.
Not wait for it to be handed down, right? Maybe this is
Yep.
where Coach might disagree, but like this is not a case of like you wait for the people at the top to do the right thing or you leave them alone once they're at the top.
That's right. And I would say that's one of the things that I think sometimes gets us into trouble as like elected officials, right, who come from community is when, and I would argue that like Tim Walz is also one of those people, right, who's like comes from community, is that when we're disconnected from the people who got us there, right, or suddenly like the community is like, oh, we're good because they're in there, instead of like we're going to continue to have a relationship of reciprocity to make sure that the ideas that are coming right into the capital are coming from the people who are directly impacted and affected, and that we're always thinking about how we're building support for the kind of life we want to live. And I think that so much of that is just like people think that elections are the only thing, and they are a one of the most important tools in our toolbox. But then the real work of governing, right, and advocacy, like then that begins the day after the election or several days after the election when we know
Okay, fine. Like
what
take a
the outcome will
nap.
be.
What
Yeah,
do
that's
what
right.
you need to do.
That's right. But I think like, there's this narrative out there that somehow there's like one thing that we do, right? And that's voting. And it is the most, it is like the most important tool, but it's not the only tool. And then we have to continue to do this work together.
I've just gotten so much out of talking to you. Like, it is a tough time, and I take some pride, to be honest, in the fact that I know from my own personal journey that doing the work is the antidote to despair, right? Uh, and that doing the work is okay, just speaking for me, is a selfish act in some ways. Like, it's the work I do to keep going. Like, it doesn't actually even have to win. Like, I don't need a victory, right? In order to keep doing the work, because that's sort of the part of like, it's for me. It kind of usually does help other people, but you know, that's not the point. The electoral victory is not the point. Like, the point is I've done the thing that fills my heart. Um, so talking to you has been I've been reminded of that, and that's really important. But I need to ask you if you have anything else you want to say. Um, you said a lot. Uh, got anything at the
I,
end?
yeah, I mean, I would say this, I talk a lot about, um, I talk a lot about my mom, and I want to just give um, a little bit of my mom and her advice to folks as we are, hurtling towards election day. Um, which is two things. The first being when the Dobbs decision was overturned in 2022, um, I was distraught, like many of us. And we were literally, Tim Walls and I are filming a campaign commercial when the decision came down, right? Like hair, makeup, lights, all the things. And then we get this news. And I was like, I just need to take a break. And I called my mom. And my mom said, well, I've been preparing you your whole life for this moment. And it was kind of like a buck up, kiddo, right? Sort of message, but also just true, right? And that her mother had been preparing her whole life, right? And so on and so forth. And so, and she's like, and you know what you got to do? She's like, you got to get this done. And so so I wiped the tears from my eyes and we filmed those campaign commercials and we fought like hell and we got a trifecta. And the first bill that was introduced in the House and Senate was to protect access to abortion. And the first bill that was signed 3 weeks later was to protect access to abortion, with my daughter standing directly next to Tim Walz when he did it. So we have been prepared our whole life for this moment. And the other thing that she said when I would complain, because sometimes I would complain, um, is it's good work if you can get it, which is, just a reminder of what a privilege it is to be able to do this work, that we get to organize, that within this democracy, right, we get to be very public about how we feel and declarative about the kind of world that we want to see for our future. And we get to stand shoulder to shoulder with one another and say, I've got you and you've got me. Like, that is a privilege. And so it is good work if we can get it. And that is, I think, as we're heading into GOTV, one of the things that we can think about, whatever that role is, whatever your gift is, whatever your work is or vocation, um, it's good work if you can get it. And that is all we are charged with doing right now, like just the next good thing and the thing that we can do. And that advice and spirit of my mom has gotten me through a lot of things. So I hope that a little Pat Flanagan can help some of your listeners as they are kind of freaking out right now to remember that we are all here for a reason and just simply have to do the next good thing that's in front of us.
So if Tim Walz goes to the White House, you will become the first Indigenous female governor. Also, in a few years, you may become the first Indigenous female governor. So I want to talk about if you've allowed yourself to have a vision for what that looks like for you, like policy, personal, what it looks like for others. Can I just ask you as though you were on your way there? Because you are. Because there's the
I
thing.
appreciate that.
Here's the thing. You're on your way there. No, again, no matter what happens. So
So I would say this, we talked about representation in this moment, and I was so struck by the conversation that you had with Rebecca Nagel. I adore her. Um, and when she said representation is not enough, she's totally right. It is the actions and what you do afterwards. And I would argue that we've been able to do a lot of good stuff in Minnesota in partnership with tribal communities. But in 2018, it really was this beautiful moment, right? Where we elected Congresswoman Deb Haaland, now Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, Congresswoman Sharice Davids, and then Native women all across the country were elected to state legislatures. And so um, it was really this incredible time. And I think people were like, oh, what a moment. And I was like, I don't think it's a moment. I actually think it's a movement, and that Native women have been leaders since time immemorial. It is simply the rest of society that is catching up to us and what we have always known. Um, and so I know that the conditions are right and the organizing has been right. I am a co-founder of an organization called Advanced Native Political Leadership, which is working to train and elect more Native people all across this country. And so if it is not me, if I am not the first Native American woman elected governor, if I'm not the first Native American woman governor in this country, she is shortly on her way. I am confident of that. And I would just say, regardless of what my job is in 2025, I will continue to absolutely be crystal clear that making my state, our state, the best place in the country to raise a family, the best place to grow old, that we will continue to be an island of decency because that is just who we are. And my vocation is to make sure that people are seen, heard, valued, protected, and believed. And I will do that if I'm the lieutenant governor, if I am the governor, if I am Siobhan's mom, right? If I am a nonprofit executive, regardless, my vocation remains the same. And so I'm just ready to do that work.
all right. And so what's your schedule for the next few days?
I'm on a bus. I'm like literally on a bus rolling through Minnesota, getting out the vote. I have been, let's see, Kansas, Arizona, Nevada again, and Montana for John Tester with Janish Meeting from Reservation Dogs, which was amazing. And so spent a lot of time in Native communities working to get out the vote, and I am hopeful, and people are organizing and they're plugged in. And so now for the last several days of the election, I am in Minnesota, and I am working to make sure that we keep the House, the Senate, and that we ensure that Minnesota remains blue for this presidential election with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. So I love GOTV. I love Get Out the Vote. It is one of the most wonderful times of the year. It snowed here yesterday, so it's on. And now we just got to get people out.
All right. So that's what you're going to be doing for the next 3 days. This has been 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. We will not be doing a show on Election Day 0. We will be doing a show the next day. We're going to be talking to Josh Gondelman, friend of the show. I think the perfect person to talk to no matter what. He is a comedian, but he's also just like, cool and connected. And he does have a thing where in his newsletter, he gives people pep talks. So it's kind of his shtick. So I think he's kind of perfect. But again, 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. We have 3 more days till the election. Please go out and vote. People will stop calling you to GOTV if you go vote. So, one good reason to do it, ask your friends if they have a plan to vote. Consider doing ballot curing. Georgia, one of the reasons Biden sneaked by in the last election was at least partially through ballot curing. There were enough ballots cured in that election that it might have helped him over the top. So ballot curing, GOTV, all that stuff. You can find it online, I think at Vote Save America. I'm Peggy. Thank you so much for making time in your busy schedule. I really appreciate you and all the work you've done for 20 years.
He tried to block expanding of casinos, claiming that some tribes who were applying weren't truly Native American. And he had a quote, if you remember, if some of you have seen this, where he testified in front of Congress, they don't look Indian to me. That's what he said. And he said, actually, later, he said, I think I got more Indian blood than they do. Now, he gets away with saying these things. Let's name that what that is. That is so damn racist and so unnecessary. And the idea that he would be president of the United States, this is about demeaning people. This is what he continues to do.